but on behalf of the Harvard Club of Southern California, I want to thank everybody for joining us in this Harvard Speak LA virtual event. The Harvard Club of Southern California is one of the largest and most active Harvard alumni clubs in the world, and we're delighted to be able to sponsor this event. My name is Neil Morgenbesser. I'm Harvard College class of '86 and the director of the Harvard Speak LA program, which brings the opportunity to the broader alumni community for some intellectually and academically stimulating interactions with some of the most renowned Harvard faculty members. Our 2025 talks so far have included Dr. Loretta Mickley on wildfires, astronomy professor Avi Loeb on evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, law school professor Randall Kennedy on his upcoming book on the demise of Jim Crow, retired government professor Harvey Mansfield, and philosophy professor Ned Hall on how to build a culture of intellectual vitality at Harvard. We have future commitments from English professor Stephen Greenblatt, psychology professor Stephen Pinker, Kennedy School professor Tariq Massoud, and Harvard Medical School professor Joel Hirschhorn, so stay tuned for all of those. Today, we're extremely excited to be able to hear from Professor Theda Skocpol. Professor Skocpol is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard, where she served as the Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and as Director of the Center for American Political Studies. In 2007, Professor Skocpol was awarded the Johan Skytte Prize in Political Science, one of the largest and most prestigious awards in political science, for her, quote, visionary analysis of the significance of the state for revolutions, welfare, and political trust, pursued with theoretical depth and empirical evidence, unquote. Professor Skocpol's work covers an unusually broad spectrum of topics, including both comparative politics and American politics. Her books and articles have been widely cited in political science literature and have won numerous awards, including the 1993 Woodrow Wilson Award of the American Political Science Association for the best book in political science for the previous year. Professor Skocpol's research focuses on U.S. social policy and civic engagement in American democracy, including changes since the 1960s. She's recently launched new projects on the development of U.S. higher education and on the transformations of U.S. federal policies in the Obama era. Professor Skocpol will discuss America's democracy and governing crisis. Want to know where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. So look forward to hearing from you, Professor Skocpol. Thank you again.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this invitation, and I especially look forward to our discussion after I present a little bit of an overview that draws from a lecture I gave at a career lecture I gave at the American Political Science Association last September, before the 2024 election. After my work on the Obama administration, I have worked more recently on the American right. And I will summarize some of the findings my colleagues and I made about the transformations of the Republican Party from above and below in the last 15 to 20 years, and how they set the stage for the remarkable situation that we find ourselves in right now, which I am prepared to characterize as a crisis of governance and democracy that also engulfs Harvard University, in case anybody wants to talk about that in the discussion period. So let me just pose the question that I'm going to draw together some evidence to speak to. How has it come to this? And by this, I mean a situation in which many people are afraid that the American constitutional system itself and the rule of law may be in danger, as well as the possibility of fair elections in the future. A lot of analysts have tackled this ever since Donald Trump surprised much of the social science and pundit world by winning the presidency in the Electoral College in 2016. But most of the analysts tend to focus on Trump's persona and rhetoric, or if they are thinking big, like my colleagues Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levinsky, they take a look at the nature of the American institutional system all the way back to the Constitutional Convention, and talk about the ways in which our anti-majoritarian institutions, particularly the Senate, which can be elected by a shrinking plurality of the electorate, and the presidency, which can be installed through the Electoral College rather than a majority of voters, how that interacts with a increasingly polarized divide between metropolitan America and the outer suburbs and rural areas, and the unfolding of really extraordinary changes over the last 70 years in race relations, understandings of women's place in society and family roles, and most recently, controversies about immigration, about who should be admitted to America, who should stay, and whether the United States will be a nation that welcomes immigrants in the future. And all of these matter, and I'll allude to some of them, but a lot of the research that my colleagues and I have done, and that includes both undergraduate students and graduate students, has focused on shifts in the organizational world from above and below around the Republican Party, and how the Republican Party has shifted at lightning speed, really, if in any kind of long-term perspective, since 2008 and since even 2016, to become a party in lockstep behind a would-be patrimonial autocrat, and someone who, and a party that is willing to countenance even extra legal violence or threats thereof. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research we've done to address this puzzle. The work that my colleagues and I did on this issue started a while ago by looking at money in organizations. I'm the kind of political scientist that goes beyond public opinion polls to look at money in organizations, both popular and elite organizations. And some time ago, we took a slice in time in 2002 and another at 2014, and just asked the simple question: how much money is flowing through Republican Party committees? By the way, we did the same thing for Democrats, but I'm only going to talk about the right side of this now. I can talk about the left later if you like. And then we picked various kinds of organizations that matter in politics and policymaking: think tanks, constituency mobilizing organizations, non-party funders, issue advocates, and ask, what kind of resources did they control in those two non-presidential years compared to the Republican Party committees? And we saw a startling change over a very short time, in which resources once flowing through the Republican Party committees ended up flowing instead through these extra party organizations. And in fact, if you look at this over time, by the time you get to 2016, one particular set of extra party organizations, the Koch network, with Americans for Prosperity, a three-tiered extra party organization at its centerpiece, actually controlled more resources than the Republican Party committees altogether. And Americans for Prosperity, the darker areas here show places where it installed its organization 2004 to 2007, the lighter areas up to 2016, and no chapter at all. And you can see that even though the Koch brothers had their, Charles is now not with us any longer, David is, but their corporate empire was in Texas and Oklahoma, they installed their political machine, able to influence elections and policy battles in far-flung states, including some that since that 2004 and 2007 period, like Wisconsin and North Carolina, have actually moved to being much more conservative. The Koch network and AFP combined at-will central direction. I mean, unlike a lot of organizations on the left, if you are an operative in this in the Koch network in the past and you didn't win the policy battle, you were gone within a month. There was no due process. And it was a network able to deploy grassroots activists, lobbying, media, and money continuously, not just in Republican primaries or general elections for Congress, state legislatures, presidency, but also for policy battles, above all the policy battles over whether Obamacare would pass in the first place and whether it would be expanded to the various states to cover middle-income people and poor people. Paralleled, the Koch network paralleled, outflanked, and leveraged the Republican Party, and it was very consistently focused on a strict agenda. Even though people might join the network from the pro-gun movement, the anti-abortion movement, the Christian right. The Koch network itself was focused on lowering taxes, particularly on wealthy people, breaking up public sector unions, which they saw as the backbone of the Democratic Party, and removing regulation on the market economy, including regulations, environmental regulations that were seen as a threat to the extractive industries that many of its funders supported. The bottom line about this Koch network, and we showed this in rigorous research, really, that I can't go into greater detail about, was that it boosted the Republican Party in many ways. It helped it win elections, and it helped ensure that elected Republicans at all levels would follow the Koch party agenda preferences in policymaking. But it also weakened the Republican Party because it hollowed it out as an organization able to balance popular and elite interests. One of the key questions is that given that the Koch network did a lot to transform the Republican Party and was particularly successful during the presidencies of Barack Obama, they didn't prevent Barack Obama from being reelected, but they installed a lot of Republican power in Congress that frustrated much of his agenda and much of the Democratic Party's agenda. Mitch McConnell was the architect of much of that stalling and obstruction. And you could argue that the Kochified Republican Party was quite successful and could simply have outlasted the two Obama presidencies. And some of my colleagues in political science think that Republicans are fated to be a permanent minority for demographic reasons. I actually disagree with that. I think if we look at the Republican Party nationally and across many states over the last 2.5 decades, they've done pretty well at winning a lot of elections. Some of them by outright majorities and some of them by pluralities that are enough in the Electoral College or the Senate system. So the question is, why did the radicalization of the Republican Party continue during the Tea Party and with the rise of Donald Trump? Because Donald Trump, although he handed a fair amount to the Koch people in his first presidency, particularly big tax cuts that they loved, he was not their guy. He was not their candidate. And so he brings a dimension of what I call ethno-nationalist populism that has bubbled up from below and has remade the Republican Party yet again. So the argument that we've developed and tested against quite a bit of evidence, including work my colleagues and I did on the Tea Party in 2009 to 2014, and the work that I did in the field visiting counties that supported Donald Trump, 8 counties across the Midwest and Upper South, to talk to people on the left and right in those places. As the Republican Party was remade leading into 2014 and 2016, it was also hollowed out. And a lot of the priorities of the Koch network were not popular with most Americans, if you believe the opinion polls, and often were not popular with grassroots people in and around the Republican Party. Even with Sarah Palin as his vice president, for example, John McCain in 2008 fell short of being elected, and Tea Party rebellions broke out during Barack Obama's presidency. And in the research that my colleagues and I did, which consisted of going out there and talking face to face to Tea Party activists in various parts of the country, we found that they weren't fiscally conservative Republicans, and many of them hadn't even heard of the Koch network. They were worried about immigration and about the generational and racial changes that were changing America. And many of them were Christian right people who very concerned about the changes in family roles and women's roles in American society. So that right-wing populism from below, fueled by the Tea Party, which our research project documented some 2,000 Tea Party groups by name, and we know where they were in all parts of the country. We know that they were particularly strong in already Republican areas of the country, and they fueled victories in 2010 that cut off a lot of the possibility for passing legislation in Barack Obama's presidency. and also prodded Republican office holders from 2010 on to just refuse to compromise with Democratic presidents or Democrats in Congress. They kind of pioneered the just say no, blow it up, all up style of politics that actually along the way removed some of the rising conservative Republicans like Eric Cantor in Virginia. What Trump finally brought to this mix was a national focus, because the Tea Party originally was very energetic and able to elect people to Congress and state legislatures, but not able to agree on particular national focus. But Donald Trump brought that. And I remember in one of my interviews in the field in 2011, talking to a woman, a Tea Party activist with a little pin on her lapel that said, "Don't worry, God is in charge." She was also a Christian right activist. She was very, very intrigued with Donald Trump at that time because he had just announced his questions about Barack Obama's legitimacy as an American and his birth certificate. I think if he had been available rather than Mitt Romney to run for the presidency in 2012, she would have enthusiastically backed him. And I just say that the broad social context in which all of this is unfolded, particularly at the grassroots, has been documented by many of us in political science who studied policy positions unfolding in state as well as national party platforms on the left and right. And what we've seen is one set of polarizing societal issues after another unfolding in an increasingly sharply polarized party system. First, we had the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. It started in the 1930s, but unfolded to culmination in the 1960s. And that polarized Democrats and Republicans in ways they hadn't been before. Then we had polarization over women's roles and family issues, abortion, and most recently gay rights from the 1970s and 80s on. And then most recently, and I think this is kind of the final ingredient in the extreme polarization that we see now leading into Donald Trump's two presidential victories, increased polarization between the two parties on immigration, on who should be admitted to the country, who should be expelled from the country. And these three kinds of polarizations interacting with one another and disagreements about the role of government in the economy produces an extremely explosive mix in our electoral and governmental politics, and has caused many people on the right to question whether they want to go along with elections in which the other side might win. By the start of the 2015-16 electoral cycle, which brought Donald Trump to the fore, many grassroots Republicans were just as angry with Republican Party leaders and the Koch network to the degree that they knew about it as they were with Democrats, because they didn't think those party leaders had handled same-sex marriage, illegal immigration, and government spending, by which they meant spending on Obamacare, which they saw as something that went to a lot of illegal immigrants, really. That's what people told me in the field. They were just as angry at them as they were at Democrats. So that helped to undermine the ability of the Republican Party to block Donald Trump, because Donald Trump aligned himself with their anger. We know that among all Republican and GOP leading voters at that critical juncture, those most angry about immigration and social diversity were more supportive of Trump in 2016 than they were of all those other Republicans that contended for the nomination in the Republican Party. And we also know that the most racially resentful Republican leaning primary voters, and that's measured by asking people questions about stereotypes about blacks, and that divides not just Democrats from Republicans, but Republicans in their own ranks. And the most resentful Republicans, as compared to other Republicans, were more likely to support Donald Trump. Oh,
I think you've gone mute. We lost your audio.
Am I back now?
Yep, you're back.
Okay. The other big polarization that has unfolded in interaction with race, family, and immigration is a growing split between metropolitan areas and college towns on the one hand, inner suburbs, and the outer suburbs, small cities, and rural areas on the other hand. That's gotten sharper and sharper with each election in recent cycles. So let me just wrap up by saying that this gets us 2016, and the first Trump presidency was an uneasy compromise between the radicalization that had unfolded around the Republican Party from above through the Koch network, multi-billionaires who wanted tax cuts, regulatory eviscerations, union busting, and below, very different kinds of radicalizing forces that wanted a change, a reversal of many of the societal and cultural changes that had unfolded in recent times. That presidency worked by kind of handing out different parts of the federal administration to different factions, so that the environmental and fiscal parts of government were handed to the Koch network people, often people named by them, and the Homeland Security and he thought the Justice Department and other agencies that would have to do with social issues were tilted toward pro-life or anti-immigration supporters. We know that when Trump came to the end of his first term and failed to be reelected, particularly his grassroots ethno-nationalist supporters were called upon to repudiate Biden's electoral victory, and many of them answered the call, believing that their champion had been unjustly denied the presidency and stormed the Capitol. There were similar kinds of violent incidents or threats of violence in many localities and states as well. But, and this was a crucial turning point for the Republican Party, the Republican Party in the immediate aftermath ended up tolerating or embracing the insurrectionist version of Trumpism rather than disabling it. And that had enormous consequences for the country, but also for their own party. Republicans in the House of Representatives went along with trying to overturn the election. And in the Senate, at the direction of Mitch McConnell, Republican senators failed to generate enough votes to ratify impeachment and bar Donald Trump from running from office again. From that time on, really, I think we can see Trump was free to regroup, plan anew, continue to take over the Republican Party at all levels with a combination of legal and threatening means, and this time around work with think tanks to plan a much more sudden and complete transformation of governance in the United States should he win the presidency again. We know that part of that between 2020 and 2024 and to the present day was persuading a lot of people in the Republican Party and in establishment groups around it, and a fair number of other American elite groups as well, to tolerate a politics of social media orchestrated threats that cause many people in the judiciary, in the federal government, in business, in the university world, in the media world, to be afraid to stand up to increasingly extra legal and unconstitutional steps to disable potential opponents to what Trump and Republicans want in power. Such threats have turned out to be very effective, with Republicans hoping for election and re-election, but also with a lot of managers and professionals who worry about their bottom lines or their career prospects. And I'll just say that an important new book that I just read last summer convincingly shows that a final ingredient in the current situation is provided by Donald Trump himself, in some ways, it's the oldest kind of governing effort in the world. A patrimonial ruler who sees himself as the center of a personally loyal network and who wants to use his ability to reward and punish. I would say reward and punish inside the United States, reward and punish with tariffs on the world stage, reward and punish with threats of legal action, you name it, to get everybody to come to him to beg for exceptions or favors or to face disfavorable treatment if they don't go along. That is corrupt patrimonial rule. When installed in a capitalist system, it also brings crony capitalism. It brings something that is very bad for capitalist businesses, in my opinion, because it means that you do well economically, not according to whether you bring good products to market or make smart investment decisions in an open market, but if you whose ear you can catch in and around the supreme ruler and the court that he maintains. So I think that's where we are now. And I'll just say that I believe the current situation is not likely to be undone easily during the 4 years that our constitutional system guarantees a president and his appointees to remain in office. So I think that no matter whether the Democrats win the House of Representatives or not in 2026, there will be a lot of retribution and chaos and patrimonial corruption for the next 3.5 years. And so many people ask me, well, what can you do if you don't like that? And I have to say, it's not just Democrats who don't like that. I think a lot of independents don't like it. There's evidence that a certain slice of people who were enthusiastic about Donald Trump's return to office have changed their mind. Not many, but some. And there are certainly independents who do not like the current situation. Filing lawsuits turns out to put roadblocks in the way of some of this, particularly the blatant contradictions of constitutional or legal principles, but it's a slow process subject to reversal. And I think in many cases will be a long road leading to Supreme Court decisions that will back Donald Trump. Peaceful nationwide demonstrations, which we're definitely seeing, inspire media coverage. And I think they do convince a lot of people that they're not alone in thinking that things are awry. But they're not likely in and of themselves to stop things, and they could, if they become unruly, allow the president to invoke emergency repressive powers, because he does control the means of coercion right now. Citizen networking across most districts and states is in some ways the most effective way to prepare the ground for victories of non-MAGA forces in local, state, and congressional offices through 2026. And I think that's going on. One of the things I researched in 2016 were the 2,000 to 3,000 usually female-led anti-Trump resistance groups that appeared in all parts of the United States, every single congressional district practically, and helped to prevent the repeal of the Affordable Care Act in 2017. And I think although a lot of that is not as formally organized as it used to be, many of those older women are still at it, and many new people are kind of talking to their neighbors, talking to their friends, talking to their family members about what things like the current Republican budget will mean for their schools, their hospitals, their drug treatment centers, the immigrant people who work in their cafes or in vital industries like the dairy industry, where I met dairy farmers in Western Wisconsin who had voted for Trump, but certainly did not want their immigrant families who run their dairy farms taken away in the middle of the night. So the final thing that I think citizens are doing now is pushing America's elites. I mean, I have to say, I don't think America's elites have exactly been out front in defending market principles, legal principles, constitutional principles. We we saw an absolutely, in my view, craven caving of major law firms to extortionist demands that really, once you give in to one, more will come. We've seen media outlets refusing to stand with others that are excluded from White House briefings, making deals that put a lot of money into Donald Trump's personal pocket and really compromise them, because once you make a deal, you're compromised in many ways. So let me just close my presentation and open the discussion by saying I do think that there are principles to keep in mind about that come as much from comparative research that's going on, and I teach with Daniel Ziblot, so I'm aware of the comparative research on democratic backsliding in other countries like Hungary, India, Brazil for a period. The question is, looking back at the 1920s, what can happen when democratic institutions begin to be captured by autocrats that may go very far in overturning any kind of rule of law? And I think principle number one is that key civil society institutions have to cooperate laterally. They have to cooperate with one another, not make bargains or deals one by one with the would-be autocrat. That means universities have to pool resources. For example, to run ad campaigns about the value of the science research that's being destroyed in universities and why average Americans who may have a relative with cancer have a stake in that. I can assure you that's a message that regular people hear and believe if they hear it. We can talk about the role that foreign students make, for many state universities, by the way, in lowering the costs of tuition for
Oh, we've lost your audio again.
Okay, can you
You're
hear me
back.
now?
Yep.
All right.
The
And
role that
then,
foreign students play in state universities. That's where we lost
yeah, I think, well, I was asked this question by somebody tied to the leaders of the University of Indiana. Now, Indiana University in Bloomington, and obviously that's a state university like Michigan State, where I was an undergraduate, and they face very different constraints than private universities. But the ban on foreign students is going to affect all American universities, and it will raise the costs of going to college for native-born families, students of native-born students. So, and I said to the person from Indiana University, talk to your state legislatures about the stake that local businesses have in the research that goes on in the university. Just get practical. Skip the fancy language about principles or the use of words like Latinx, which I'm totally opposed to, and just talk to people about the on-the-ground consequences of some of these measures. And obviously, law firms, businesses, and professional and medical and legal associations need to work together to have the back of those that are targeted at any given time, to work out some practical solutions to keep them from being too damaged. Because we do know that autocrats, before they fully consolidate power, are bullies who back down if they face concerted opposition. And I think that's especially true in the United States right now. Finally, I would say state governments and regional compacts of state governments have a very big role to play in this. One of the things that makes the United States different from Hungary, where an autocracy with an electoral trimming on it was consolidated in a very short time in recent years. The United States is a federal political system, and as you all know, the state of California is practically several nations unto itself. And we've got states on the East Coast that can work together, that have worked together sometimes on environmental issues, stretching into the upper Midwest. Maybe we could all join Canada. I mean, that would be my favorite constitutional change, but that's a joke. I don't really mean that. What I do mean is that state governments, if they concert with one another about what they're going to do under various scenarios, not anything illegal, not anything extreme, and make sure that they're appointing good people, say to the public health agencies that may be the only place where we're going to have effective vaccines and effective research for the new vaccines, or as the NIH is gutted under RFK. I can't believe I'm saying that. That's the place that a lot can happen over the coming years, and that's the place from which the federal government will be reconstructed in the parts of it that have been gutted. And there are parts that have been gutted that are very valuable. And if there's a change in the future, will have to be built back better, if I could use a phrase. And that'll be drawing on what the states have learned and done effectively. So there's a lot of room for not flashy resistance, but simply continued innovation in effective governance and responsive governance and inclusive governance, as well as saying no when it's necessary to say no at the level of the states, as well as major civil society institutions. So let me stop there and open the floor for any comments. Dissenting comments are welcome, and questions and suggestions that you might have. And I'll go out of this so that I can see people.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Let me kick it off with a question, and then everybody's invited to submit questions on the chat, and I will submit them to Professor Skocpol for her response. Let me start with what you raised with the Republican Party, because I think there's something very interesting there, and I don't know what the answer is. You were talking about the difference between the popular interests and the elite interests, and it strikes me that if the elite interests had more power, there would be no Donald Trump, right? The Republican Party didn't want him in 2016, not least because they thought he wouldn't win. But I think in 2020, if it could have been costless to oppose him, and they weren't afraid of him, they would have done so. I think even now, the Republican Party elites would like to get rid of him. But the popular view in the Republican Party is very pro-Trump, and he's got a massive amount of support, as a demagogue would. So is there a solution from within the Republican Party? Does it require him to fail in some way? Is the resistance from outside the Republican Party going to be more effective, or is this just a waiting game and we have to see where things are in the midterms and in 2028?
Well, your comments parallel a lot of what our research showed, especially as late as 2016. I think what we could call a Republican Party establishment, and I would include in that not just elected party leaders and party committees, but also the Koch network itself, and other plutocratic entities around the Republican Party, were not enthusiastic about Trump's candidacy. On the other hand, once he got there and delivered some things they really wanted, many of them became more enthusiastic, especially since they hoped he would just continue to do what they wanted and not what they didn't want if he were reelected. Mitch McConnell bears a great deal of responsibility for the fact that this man was able to run for the nomination again. And I agree that many Republican elites and office holders are afraid of Donald Trump, but some are also opportunists. And, we really can't classify any human beings, including ourselves, into these neat little categories. Many people are a mixture of both, and there's an eerie tendency, including on Wall Street, to think, well, maybe it's really not going to be that bad. Maybe he's not really going to do all that stuff. So I am not of the school of thought that this can all be blamed on upset and angry popular forces. I certainly have been out there and have talked to many of those popular forces, and I can tell you that some of them are pretty far out there. It's an interesting experience interviewing people, but I don't think they're the only forces. They provide the impetus for the anti-immigrant extremism, but they're not the source of the bash the universities stuff. That's coming from frustrated Ivy Leaguers who attended these colleges and think they didn't get their due while they were there. It's a factional group that's driving that. So I agree with your analysis overall. What can it change from within the Republican? I think we see some Republicans who have stood up, some of them with extraordinary steel in their spines. We see a fair number of people who've become independents, and I think many who have been Republican voters have switched their registration to independent, as many Democrats have switched too, and are a force. In especially close elections, they can make the difference. The thing is, in 2024, many Democratic voters either stayed home or occasional voters who were usually working people upset about inflation and persuaded by some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric were the ones that tipped the election toward Trump. But it wasn't a huge victory. I do think there are chances, if elections continue, for a combination of Democrats and independents and disillusioned Republicans or dissenting Republicans to begin to limit and reverse Trumpian radicalism. It is radical. It's not conservative.
Yeah. Okay, here are some questions. Scott asks, looks like we're in the opening phases of a strategic attack on our democratic systems. Can you point out any more about the objectives and design of the strategic attack?
Yeah, I think a lot of people in political science had come around to the view during the first Trump presidency and after January 6th that this was an effort to disable elections, both access to the ballot and honest counting of elections. And those efforts continue in states that have a monopoly of red supermajorities in their legislatures and very right-wing. Texas, let's just think Texas. So those efforts continue. But I actually think that we're seeing something much more extreme here, which is an effort to destroy the resource base of people who don't want to go along with patrimonial ethnic authoritarianism. So I don't believe the attacks on the universities are about anti-Semitism. I don't at all. I can assure you that Jewish and non-Jewish faculty and students and administrators are getting along just fine at Harvard University. Some of my finest students every single year are Jewish students. Jewish people in the United States and Israel, and I've visited Israel many times, disagree about everything. So they're on all sides of every issue. And this is not about anti-Semitism. This is an effort to destroy the resource base of institutions that people around Donald Trump and Donald Trump, when he thinks about it, believe will be opposed to him. And the same is true for some of the attacks on legal firms and media sources, either attacking them or creating new ones as alternatives. And I think in the business community, what the attempt is to create a system in which wealth is tied to, we see it in Hungary, wealth is tied to connections to the ruler and his inner circle. So I think that is a deliberate set of objectives. I think there are swirling groups. I call it a competitive sycophancy. Trump has surrounded himself with little groups of people who are trying to outdo one another in satisfying him that they're doing what he wants, and he gets to pick and choose after they come forward with one outlandish plan after another. That is a very dangerous thing to have in control of the Pentagon and the Justice Department, let alone the science agencies of the federal government.
Okay. Tina Smith asks, given the advances in AI, the availability of first-rate educational lectures on YouTube and other websites such as Digital Dante, and the increasing number of online universities, what is the value proposition of Harvard or any other university aside from the alumni network. And maybe I can expand on that and just tell us how you think Harvard is handling this so far, and maybe what your prescription for Harvard would be.
You mean about AI?
No, I mean, I think the question Tina's asking is what's the value proposition that Harvard offers or that universities offer in today's world? And then I'm asking maybe broaden that into what should Harvard be doing to establish that or to respond to the attacks from the administration.
All right, well, I don't want to upset people, but there's a lot of research out there, and there has been for quite some time, that indicates that people don't necessarily learn a great deal of content during their time at universities. I think there's some evidence that they learn how to learn and that they make connections with one another. And of course, a university like Harvard is connections to the nth degree. I was an undergraduate at Michigan State University, and the great state university systems are the engine of the post-World War II expansion of higher education in the United States, mainly because they let in so many people and educated so many first-time college goers whose children then became the ones who could apply to places like Harvard and Stanford and Yale and Princeton, what I call the super wealthy universities. The super wealthy universities are going to come through this period. I don't want to minimize the damage. The damage is very great already, but they're going to come through it, and they will continue to be very attractive for at least domestic applicants. And we turn away 96 people for every one we let in. We could let in, I was once told by the Harvard admissions people, they could let in 2 entire classes that were equally well qualified by the measures they use. So I'm not too worried. I expect long after I'm gone, Harvard will still be a vibrant, interesting place, particularly for undergraduates. And I love my undergraduates, and professors there love their undergraduates. And I don't think that's going away. Now, I'll just say that Mary Waters and I teach a big gen ed class, American Society and Public Policy, and we require people to take off their watches, put aside all their electronics, and come in and write out their final exams on blue books. We give them the questions in advance, but they've got to think and they've got to write. We've had some bad experiences with AI, and we won't put up with it. Now, I'm not sure whether that'll hold in the future, but that's what we're doing. We're still requiring people to read, to think. One kid said on the evaluations that we require them to learn facts, and you bet we do. We do. And we test whether they learned those facts. And so I think a mixture of old and new. We use PowerPoint, we use videos, we use all kinds of electronic resources. I'm sure there'll be uses for AI to some degree, but not in place of learning. So let me just, that's that. Now, the attacks on Harvard are grievous to the degree that they're not stopped by the courts, and I think they may be. Barring international students from coming to Harvard means the School of Public Health and the Kennedy School are on life support. The cutting off of research grants is devastating scientific research at the medical school, the School of Public Health, and to a lesser degree in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. We have a hiring freeze at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and have been told to plan for 20% budget cuts. I'm part of a group of faculty that has pledged to reduce our salaries by 10%. So the only thing I can say is that Trump has a way of bringing people together in support of the Western liberal tradition. He brought Australians together. He brought Canadians together. He brought many of the powers of Europe together, and he brought the Harvard faculty together. We are not arguing anymore about whether library protests are okay. In my opinion, they never were. We are not arguing about all the stuff that tore the universities apart after the heinous attacks of October 7th. We are united behind a president, Alan Garber, that I don't think anybody would have imagined was going to become a world-striding hero. It's just that when you get a letter at your university that says, we would like to take an ungrammatical letter, by the way, from an incompetent federal administration that can't even run its own business, saying we would like to take over every course, every department, every faculty hiring, every student admission. It's not hard to say no to that. There's really no choice but to say no to that. And so we are going to adapt, fight back through the courts, and prevail. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. And we need the support of all of our students, their families and friends across the country, of all of our alumni. And in addition to giving money, the most important thing you can do is talk to your friends and neighbors and talk about the truth of what really happens in America's wide array of wonderful universities and why we all have a stake in preserving that.
Okay. Thank you. Charlotte asks, you said that the Supreme Court may likely support Trump. Is this based on your own research or research of colleagues you respect?
Well, I sort of follow as an amateur, but also read the expert research. And I do think there's a 5 or 6 justice majority for what we're already seeing, which is the reversal of the Chevron doctrine and the gutting of the federal, any independence in the federal bureaucracy. We're already seeing some cases giving the Trump administration the ability to overrule independent agencies and stock them as they would like. I don't think we know what the Supreme Court is going to come down on questions of immigrant due process, but there are some signs that they may stand up for due process, which if they stand up for it for immigrants, they'll probably stand up for it for Harvard, for that matter. I don't think the Supreme Court is going to go along with threatening law firms, because even the conservative justices have an interest in having vigorous arguments presented to them, and they probably won't go along with destroying Harvard, although I don't know. But the legal route is long and uncertain. There are reversals. There are some pretty extraordinary abilities to select your judge. And on the right, those are even stronger than on the left, because you can go to that one district in Texas where you know exactly what judge you're going to get. And that happened just a couple days ago. Something the state legislature there wouldn't pass was done by the governor and backed up by I can't remember the judge's name in the gerrymandered district in Texas, where it goes to the Fifth Circuit, and maybe 5 years from now the Supreme Court will look at it. So it's not a substitute for making citizens aware and getting citizens to work together and citizens to vote and otherwise participate in politics. And I think one of the problems we've seen in the Democratic Party in recent times is the willingness to sit back and wait until the judicial system does it. Well, once Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, that's just not going to happen, in my opinion. So I follow it partly because my son was a Supreme Court clerk. And so I pay attention to the cases and think about, not that he tells me anything, he doesn't tell me a thing, but I tried to educate myself on what the lines of argument are and which ones are likely to result in majorities. And I think the decision to say that Donald Trump was free from prosecution was an extraordinary transformation of the American constitutional system.
Okay. John Bird says, I don't disagree with your proposals. I think they're wise, but can you give us some historical examples where your specific proposals have worked?
Well, I don't know enough about the Polish case, but I think at least the initial effort of a ethno-nationalist authoritarian regime to lock in was stymied there. I think there were some cases in interwar Europe and I'm not remembering which ones, obviously not Italy and Germany, but remember in Germany, the crucial steps that enabled Donald Trump were the abrogation of federalism that occurred 2 years before. I mean, not Donald Trump, excuse me, Adolf Hitler. Was the abrogation of federalism in Germany that occurred 2 years before Hitler was invited into power. That's when the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats allowed the Prussian bureaucracy to be taken over without a protest. So I think it's very important to kind of sort out which things are worth pushing back and organizing with others about and which ones are not. And I know that's difficult, but I think there's some evidence both in the past and in the contemporary period that it won't work if you just cave in one at a time, and then it might work if you work together. And I also think there are some things that are unique about the United States. I don't happen to think that most Americans really want what's unfolding right now. And although public opinion is not enough, it is enabling.
Okay. Nicole says, thanks for your talk. How do these radical events and movements seem like or not at all like a revolution in light of the revolutions you've studied?
Well, they've unfolded in the Republican Party in ways that have some similarities to what happened in the takeover of the Fidesz party in Hungary, transforming both popular and elite constituencies around it. And that's not the same thing as the revolutions I studied in France, Russia, and China that happened in agrarian monarchies with peasant revolts. So it's a much more gradual, quasi-legalistic set of changes that unfolds, and it can kind of come up from behind on you and catch you with a degree of transformation you didn't think was there. But I will say this, I did start out my career studying revolutions, and the organs of coercion are crucial in a state. States have changed over many hundreds of years, and democracies or electoral systems are very different from agrarian monarchies. But what isn't different is that those who control the means of coercion and legal authority and can deploy them to disable political opposition or destroy political opposition can lock in their power for quite a long time. But we don't really have to go to the far past. We could go back 100 years to the period right after the American Civil War, when democratic forces in the United States were extraordinarily hopeful that a multiracial democracy and a free market, married to a free market, vibrant capitalist society was going to prevail under Republican Party rule, and it was all undone in the space of several decades, and especially from the perspective of African Americans, but also many white Americans whose political views were frustrated at the same time. 70 years of something that wasn't democratic locked in, and that was authoritarian and in many cases very violent for those who were subjected to it. So it's not as if America is some inevitably unfolding fairy story. We've had periods of advance and decline, and we know that what undid the decline or the reversals at the end of Reconstruction through Jim Crow was the building of cross-class and multiracial coalitions from the New Deal forward, and it was a several-decade process.
I'll do two more and then I think we'll let you go. Adam asks, says, I think there's a lot of talk on resisting Trump, but not so much about what Democrats have to do to be more appealing and bring positive change. Woke culture and all this fancy language and censoring didn't really get us anywhere. I think we need better reasons to vote for Democrats, not just, oh, if we don't vote for Democrats, our democracy will be destroyed.
I
There's a
have
question.
I have two slightly contradictory things to say about that. One, I think Democrats absolutely have to just get a voice and talk in everyday language. My husband and I go to a diner, a working class diner, middle class diner at 6 a.m. every morning. We interact with a sustained but slightly shifting network of people who are not in the Harvard faculty lounge or where Bill was in the Boston University faculty lounge. And we talk in plain language. We listen to raunchy jokes. We deal with the patriots. We talk about people's families, and we talk about ethnic and racial things and certainly gender things in terms that are, you know, semi-serious everyday language. And Democrats, more Democrats than you might realize, know that we just have to get off our high horse about language and jargon. I tell people when they're talking about the Republican budget right now, don't use the word reconciliation. Who knows what that is? Talk about budget changes that are going to have an impact on things people really care about. I think people out there do care, and they're not stupid. And that includes people on the right. The Tea Party people I interviewed face to face were not stupid. They were misinformed in many cases, badly misinformed. I remember the guy who said to me, question number 7 on my list was, where do you get your information? He looks at me, he says, not where you do. And he wasn't kidding. He watched Fox News from beginning to end of the day in a steady diet. So he got lies and racial and ethnic slurs all day. And not to mention the attacks on women, which I think are very much part of today's very aggressive Pete Hegseth style conservatism. Nothing Christian about it, and nothing strong about it, but it's a cultural style. So Democrats have to avoid using weird words, avoid talking insider language. But beyond that, I think Democrats have been already for quite some time advancing policies that do make life better or defending policies that make life better. Healthcare, improving Social Security, investing in infrastructure. Joe Biden did a lot to build the lineaments of a degree of manufacturing revival in the United States. Democrats need a much more sensible set of ideas and ways of talking about immigration. Long and short of it, I think most Americans support controlled entry, but do not support seizing and deporting people who are longstanding neighbors, family members, fellow churchgoers. And so it's there, and many Democrats are already doing it. That said, we do not need a Leninist style plan, 5-year plan, because Donald Trump and the people around him are messing up, and they're going to keep messing up. And we live in a two-party system where if you don't vote for the one, you vote for the other. That is going to be a dynamic going into 2026 in particular. And if we nominate as Democrats, I'll speak right now as a Democrat, if we nominate some common sense people for president and vice president in 2028, they will have a very good chance, because Donald Trump is not running again, and he does not have an obvious successor with his same kind of personal appeal.
Okay, last question. Scott asks, can we learn anything useful from looking at Hungary and Orban? And I guess I would expand that to be, you know, Duterte and Bolsonaro and others.
Well, we can certainly learn what's scary that can happen. I think I already pointed to the key difference between the United States and Hungary, which is we've got a federal system. Hungary had a constitution that was very easy to change. It's a unitary polity. So that made it easier to consolidate an authoritarian electoral system they've got the electoral trimmings, pretty quickly with modifications to the Constitution that allowed takeover of the media system and frankly destruction of university governance. I don't think that's going to be possible in the United States that quickly. But I don't rule out the possibility of chaos and violence in the United States. And it's extremely disturbing that Americans are living in existentially different worlds in which, when I did my research, I researched the Tea Party, and then 8 years later, I researched the grassroots anti-Trump resistance in 2016 and 2017, and people used practically the same words to me. They said, I feel the future of the country is at stake, that everything I care about in America will go away if those people win. They said that on both sides. Now, I don't think it's a both sides thing because I don't think most Democrats have actually countenanced violence. I don't believe that has happened in this period. It happened in the past, but it's not happening in this period. And so I think the degree to which many in the Republican Party are going along with violence or threats of violence is very frightening. And I won't tell you that I sleep well at night. I do not. I'm very, very frightened. But I don't think it's locked in yet.
Okay. Well, I'll end with a comment from Charlotte, which says, I remember Professor Skocpol from 1985, and I'm delighted to see that she looks exactly the same while the rest of us have aged from 20 to 60. We must get your Fountain of Youth secret. So with that, I just want to thank you so much and everybody else for participating. And this has been a great discussion. And we'll check back in with you hopefully in a year and see where we are. And hopefully we'll have good progress to report. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks to all of you out there on the beautiful coast. Keep at it.
Okay, take care.
All right.
Bye.